In this video, we're going to go over the history of the Sega Saturn and how it was a vital part of the gaming console wars.
Who gives you a game that lets you fly? Sega! And who gives you access to the internet on your TV? Sega! Play games, surf the net, only on Sega Saturn. Sega!
Welcome to the real world, Sega Saturn.
At a time when the video game industry was transitioning from 2D to 3D graphics, Sega's ambitious yet troubled 32-bit machine emerged as a technological marvel that would ultimately face a challenging battle against fierce competition. The Saturn's story is one of innovation, internal conflict, and corporate missteps that would forever alter Sega's position in the gaming landscape. The origins of the Saturn project began in 1992, during an era when Sega was riding high on the success of the Genesis. This console had managed to break Nintendo's iron grip on the market, particularly in the United States, where they controlled roughly 55% of both the hardware and software market by early 1995. Backed by aggressive advertising campaigns and the popularity of their mascot Sonic the Hedgehog, Sega appeared poised to dominate the next generation of gaming. That same year, Sega's arcade division had released the groundbreaking Model 1 arcade system board, which showcased revolutionary 3D polygon-based games like Virtua Racing and Virtua Fighter games itself. These titles would prove crucial to popularizing 3D polygonal graphics in the industry and demonstrated Sega's technological prowess in the arcades. The challenge now was to bring this advanced 3D technology into homes. So the development of the Saturn began, with Hideki Sato, Sega's director and deputy general manager of research and development, supervising it. According to project manager Hideki Okamura, the project, codenamed Saturn, started over 2 years before its announcement at the Tokyo Toy Show in June 1994. It was developed by the same team that created the System 32 arcade board, though Sato would later express regret that he didn't base the Saturn on the Model 1 arcade hardware instead. Model 1 specialized in rendering flat-shaded polygons. Had the Saturn inherited more of the Model 1's true 3D design, it would have been more straightforward to develop 3D games and compete head-on with Sony's PlayStation. Instead, the Saturn's design still resembled and was partly backward compatible with 2D sprite-scaling hardware, forcing developers to work around a more convoluted multiprocessor system for 3D. In 1993, Sega formed a joint venture with Japanese electronics giant Hitachi to develop a CPU for the Saturn. This partnership resulted in the creation of the Super H RISC engine, or SH2. While Saturn's design was largely finalized by the end of 1993, reports in early 1994 about Sony's upcoming PlayStation console prompted Sega to make a crucial last-minute addition. They included a second video display processor to improve 2D performance and 3D texture mapping capabilities. According to Kazuhiro Hamada, Sega's section chief for Saturn development, the SH2 was chosen for reasons of cost and efficiency. The chip has a calculation system similar to a DSP, but we realized that a single CPU would not be enough to calculate a 3D world. This decision led to the Saturn's unique dual CPU configuration. The Saturn was, in essence, a 2D machine with 3D bolted on. This decision would ultimately complicate the system's architecture and create challenges for developers. Meanwhile, at Sega of America, President Tom Kalinske was concerned about the direction the Saturn was taking. According to Kalinske, Sega of America fought against the architecture of Saturn for quite some time. Seeking an alternative graphics chip, Kalinske attempted to broker a deal with Silicon Graphics, but Sega of Japan rejected the proposal. Silicon Graphics would eventually partner with Nintendo on the Nintendo 64 instead, cementing a missed opportunity for Sega. In the early 1990s, after Sony had developed a CD-ROM drive for Nintendo's SNES console, only to be rebuffed at the last minute, Sega of America approached the spurned consumer electronics giant about working together on a new machine. Sony had its own game development studio, Sony ImageSoft, based in California, and it was making games for the Sega Mega CD. A relationship was there, and Kalinske saw the potential benefits of both the marketing and development talent that Sony could bring. However, according to Kalinske, Sega of Japan turned down this proposal outright. The Sega Saturn's technical specifications were impressive for its time. The system featured a dual CPU architecture with two Hitachi SH2 microprocessors clocked at 28.6 MHz and capable of 56 million instructions per second. It used a Motorola 68EC000 running at 11.3 MHz as a sound controller and featured a custom sound processor with an integrated Yamaha FH1 DSP running at 22.6 MHz. The Saturn's video capabilities were provided by two separate display processors, the VDP-1, which handled sprites and polygons, and the VDP-2, which managed backgrounds. Its double-speed CD-ROM drive was controlled by a dedicated Hitachi SH1 processor to reduce load times. System memory included 16 megabits of work RAM, 12 megabits of video RAM, 4 megabits of RAM for sound functions, 4 megabits of CD buffer RAM, and 256 kilobits of battery backup RAM. The physical design of the Saturn was sleek and modern for its era. The original Japanese model featured a dark gray, almost black casing with a CD drive on the top and a cartridge slot that allowed for memory expansion. In terms of controllers, the Saturn was equipped with a control pad that featured a directional pad and 6 face buttons, a design that many, who are into fighting games, consider one of the finest ever produced, particularly the original Japanese model. The Saturn launched in Japan on November 22, 1994, at a price of 44,800 yen, equivalent to $440 at the time. Virtua Fighter, a faithful port of the popular arcade game, was included as a pack-in title and became crucial to the system's early success in Japan, selling at a nearly 1-to-1 ratio with the console. Though Sega had wanted to launch with Clockwork Knight and Panzer Dragoon as well, the only other first-party game available at launch was a title called Wan Chai Connection. Sega had prepared approximately 500,000 consoles for launch day, but deliberately held back 300,000 units in storage for a week in an attempt to catch the fledgling PlayStation off guard when it launched on December 3rd. This strategy proved effective initially, as Sega sold at least 170,000 Saturn units on its first day of sale, making it the company's most successful console launch to that point. Pre-orders had sold out 2 weeks in advance, and customers lined up for several hours to purchase the system. To manage the crowds, staff dressed as Sega's Coneheads were brought in to maintain order. The Saturn's launch in Japan demonstrated Sega's strength in its home territory. By the end of Christmas 1994, 500,000 Saturns had been sold, compared to 300,000 PlayStation units. Sega planned to triple that figure by Christmas 1995 to 1.5 million units. As the Saturn's supply struggled to keep up with demand, Sega raised their expectations further, with plans for 1.2 million units to be sold by May 1995 and 2 million by the end of the year. While the Saturn was off to a promising start in Japan, the situation in North America would unfold quite differently. Sega of America had initially announced a Saturn Day launch date of September 2nd, 1995, with plans for 20 launch titles and an additional 100 games by Christmas. However, at the first Electronic Entertainment Expo in Los Angeles on May 11, 1995, Sega shocked the industry with a surprise announcement. Tom Kalinske took the stage and revealed that due to high consumer demand, Sega had already shipped 30,000 Saturn units to select retailers, Toys R Us, Babbage's, Electronics Boutique, and Software, etc., for immediate release at a price of $399, including a copy of Virtua Fighter. This surprise launch caught retailers, developers, and consumers off guard, setting the stage for one of the most controversial moments in console launch history. The fallout was immediate. Retailers who were not informed of the surprise release, including Best Buy and Walmart, were upset. KB Toys, which was not part of the early launch, responded by refusing to carry the Saturn and its games entirely. Meanwhile, at the same E3 event, Sony's response was calculated and devastating. During Sony's presentation, Olaf Olafsson, the head of Sony Computer Entertainment America, summoned Steve Race to the stage. Race approached the lectern, uttered a single word, $299, and walked away to thunderous applause.
$299.
undercutting Sega's price point by a full $100. The Saturn's surprise launch proved to be a strategic blunder, with only 6 games available at launch and minimal advertising compared to what had been planned for September. Sega failed to capitalize on their head start. Their most significant asset, Virtua Fighter, lacked the popularity in the West that it enjoyed in Japan, and the release schedule included only 2 additional games between the surprise launch and September 1995. By contrast, Sony's PlayStation launched on September 9, 1995, backed by a large marketing campaign with a reported $50 million budget, compared to Sega's $4 million in European marketing. Within 2 days, the PlayStation had sold more units than the Saturn had in the 5 months following its surprise launch, with almost all of the initial shipment of 100,000 units being sold in advance, and the rest selling out across the US. The technical limitations of the Saturn were beginning to show as well. A high-quality port of Namco's arcade game Ridge Racer for PlayStation garnered favorable media coverage in comparison to the Saturn version of Sega's Daytona USA, which was considered inferior to its arcade counterpart. This fueled the perception that the PlayStation was better equipped for 3D gaming, the direction in which the industry was clearly headed. On October 2, 1995, Sega announced a Saturn price reduction to $299, attempting to match Sony's aggressive pricing. Sega claimed around 120,000 Saturn units had been sold by this point, while Sony was already reporting 200,000 PlayStation sales. The situation only worsened through the holiday season, with NPD data suggesting the PlayStation was outselling the Saturn by a 2-to-1 ratio. The exact sales figures were difficult to verify, as both Sony and Sega were reluctant to disclose official numbers, and both were suspected of inflating their claims. Industry commentators speculated that the PlayStation might have been outselling the Saturn at rates ranging from 3-to-1 to as high as 12-to-1. By early 1996, Sega was taking dramatic action to counteract their losses. The company discontinued both the Sega Mega CD and Sega Nomad portable console, while shifting focus away from the 32X add-on they had launched just a year earlier. The Sega product line was effectively reduced to 3 devices: the Genesis, Game Gear, and Saturn, with the older systems expected to be discontinued within a couple of years. In March 1996, the Saturn's price dropped further to $249, with the company reporting approximately 500,000 units sold at this point. However, this paled in comparison to PlayStation software sales. 3 million Saturn games had been sold versus 8 million PlayStation games. Sega tried an innovative marketing push with the Netlink, the first genuine attempt to marry a video game console with internet capabilities, but it too failed to catch on despite undercutting other internet-enabled devices of the era with its $499 combined cost. By May 1996, the Saturn had reached 600,000 units sold in the US, while the PlayStation had doubled that figure with 1.2 million. E3 1996 brought another blow when Sony announced a PlayStation price drop to $199.99.
As we said before, either go big or go home. So, effective immediately, the Sony PlayStation will now be available for sale at retail for $199.
Which Sega was forced to match despite the Saturn's higher manufacturing costs. Tom Kalinske had lost interest in fighting what he saw as an increasingly frustrating battle with Sega of Japan pulling the strings in the US. In July 1996, Kalinske resigned, followed by the departure of David Rosen and Hayao Nakayama from their American leadership positions. Sega of America began pushing more toward educational and web-based markets, becoming less relevant to mainstream consumers. Saturn sales likely reached their peak with the launch of Nights into Dreams, which became the most successful Saturn software launch up to that point. However, the gap between the PlayStation and Saturn continued to widen and would never close. For much of 1996, the Saturn was still viewed relatively favorably, especially as Nintendo continued to delay the Nintendo 64. Some gaming magazines of the era, such as Ultra Game Players, showed the PlayStation and Saturn neck and neck in reader approval ratings around October 1996. As the Nintendo 64 prepared to launch, pressure grew on Nintendo to match the $199.99 price point of its competitors. When Nintendo did so, Sega held a press conference where Senior Vice President of Sales and Marketing Ted Hoff famously threw a smashed Nintendo 64 across the room while claiming the console didn't fly. Sega confidently predicted that the N64 would be hindered by a lack of launch software at a time when the Saturn's lineup was the strongest it had ever been. The general public wasn't convinced by Sega's bravado. When the Nintendo 64 launched in September 1996, it sold remarkably well. In a desperate move, Sega began bundling new Saturn consoles with 3 pieces of first-party software: Virtua Fighter 2, Daytona USA, and Virtua Cop, while reducing the top price of its games from $69.99 to $59.99. This 3 free games promotion did boost Saturn sales by a reported 500%, with an estimated 400,000 consoles sold in the offer's first 2 weeks. Sega sold only 1.2 million Saturn consoles in 1996, bringing the total US sales to approximately 1.6 million units. This meant the Saturn had managed only half the sales of the PlayStation, which had reached 3.2 million in the region, with the Nintendo 64 also outselling it with 1.7 million units in just 3 months. One of the Saturn's most notable absences during this period was a product to capitalize on the 1996 NFL season, leaving Sega without a competitor to the highly praised PlayStation-exclusive NFL Game Day, which went on to sell 300,000 copies. By June 1997, Sega lowered the Saturn's price to $149.99, with games capped at $49.99. By August, Sony controlled 47% of the market, Nintendo 40%, and Sega just 12%. By early March 1998, news had broken that Sega was abandoning the platform, prompting retailers to pull Saturn consoles off store shelves. Sega discontinued its Saturn TV advertising campaign before cutting the system's price to $99.95. A final wave of first-party games including The House of the Dead, Panzer Dragoon Saga, Burning Rangers, and Shining Force 3 was released in the first half of 1998. But with the Dreamcast's announcement in May, attention rapidly shifted to Sega's next console. While the Saturn struggled in the West, it maintained relative success in Japan. 1 million units had been sold in the territory by mid-1995, and to celebrate, Sega dropped the price to 34,800 yen in June, bundled with Virtua Fighter Remix. The Saturn again outsold its competitors during Christmas 1995, thanks largely to the big 3 titles: Virtua Fighter 2, Sega Rally Championship, and Virtua Cop. On March 22, 1996, Sega released a redesigned white model Saturn in Japan for 20,000 yen, less than half the original launch price, and even cheaper than the 6-year-old Super Famicom. The strategy proved successful, with 70,000 white Saturns sold in just 4 days. The Saturn's Japanese success was bolstered by strong, engaging advertising featuring Sagata Sanshiro, a character who would travel around Japan and punish those who did not play their Saturns. Thanks partly to this campaign and strong exclusive titles, the Saturn became Sega's most popular platform in Japan, selling more than the Nintendo 64. Despite having trouble with certain 3D games, the Saturn excelled at 2D titles, particularly fighting games, shoot-'em-ups, and RPGs. Capcom released exceptional Saturn ports of its 2D fighting games, including Darkstalkers 3, Marvel Superheroes, Street Fighter, and Street Fighter Alpha 3, which were noted for their faithfulness to the arcade originals. The Saturn's architecture, while complex, allowed skilled developers to create impressive 2D experiences that in many cases surpassed what was possible on competing systems. Panzer Dragoon Saga blends on-rails shooter mechanics with a deep RPG narrative across 4 discs, crafting a highly sought-after collector's item thanks to its real-time battle system and immersive storytelling. Dragon Force is a real-time strategy RPG famous for massive battles, featuring hundreds of on-screen units and multiple kingdoms, each offering its own storyline and high replay value. Guardian Heroes, a side-scrolling beat-em-up from Treasure, stands out with its branching paths, RPG-like leveling, and vibrant hand-drawn visuals. Nights into Dreams is a dreamlike flight adventure from Sonic Team that focuses on fluid aerial gameplay and whimsical presentation, leaving a lasting impression with its unique setting. Beyond their iconic hedgehog mascot, Sonic Team also turned heads with Burning Rangers, a firefighting action game. Sega did struggle to deliver a full 3D Sonic platformer for the console, most notably with the cancelled Sonic Extreme. But they did manage to release Sonic R, a racing title featuring Sonic and friends that showcased the system's ability to handle fast-paced 3D environments. In Japan, the Saturn hosted many exclusive RPGs that never made it westward. The Sakura Wars series, developed by Sega and Red Entertainment, mixed tactical RPG elements with anime cutscenes and visual novel segments, becoming one of the biggest killer apps for the Saturn in Japan. Another title, Grandia, helped popularize the Saturn in Japan, but only received a Western release on the PlayStation. The Saturn's arcade heritage resulted in excellent conversions of Sega's coin-op hits. Model 2 arcade ports like Sega Rally Championship, Virtua Cop, and Virtua Fighter 2 were generally regarded as superior to competitors on the PlayStation, running at 60 frames per second with high resolution. The Sega Saturn's discontinuation in Western markets by 1998 marked the end of its commercial life, but in many ways, it was just the beginning of the console's legacy. As Sega shifted its focus to the Dreamcast, the Saturn gradually receded from retail shelves and mainstream gaming consciousness. However, a dedicated community of enthusiasts was already forming, one that would keep the Saturn's flame burning long after Sega had moved on. Several factors contributed to the Saturn's growing status as a collector's console. First, its relatively low sales meant that hardware and games were becoming increasingly scarce, especially in North America. Second, many of the system's best games were Japanese exclusives that had never been localized, creating strong demand for imports. Third, the Saturn's CD-based games were not as durable as cartridges, making well-preserved copies even harder to find. By the mid-2000s, prices for certain Saturn games had begun to skyrocket in the secondary market. Panzer Dragoon Saga, which had received a limited North American print run of fewer than 20,000 copies, became one of the most valuable games of its generation. Other rare titles like Shining Force 3, Magic Knight Rayearth, and Burning Rangers routinely commanded prices well above their original retail cost. The Saturn's design had included a cartridge slot intended primarily for memory expansion, but this would eventually become a key entry point for hobbyists looking to modify the system. In the early 2000s, modders discovered ways to use this slot to bypass the Saturn's regional lockout, allowing Western consoles to play Japanese games without physical modifications. This breakthrough opened up Saturn's vast Japanese library to Western collectors. The next major development came with the creation of optical drive emulators and flash cartridges for the Saturn. The first widely available solution was the Rhea and Phoebe optical drive emulators, named after two of Saturn's moons, created by a hobbyist engineer known as Gdemu around 2014. These devices replaced the Saturn's aging CD drive with an SD card reader, allowing users to load games directly from memory cards instead of discs. In February 2016, Professor Abrasive, another homebrew developer, revealed the Satiator, an alternative solution that utilized the Saturn's VCD card slot to load games from an SD card without replacing any internal hardware. This was followed by the Mode, developed by Terra Onion in 2020, which offered similar functionality. These devices not only preserved aging Saturn hardware, but also opened up the system's library to a new generation of players who couldn't afford the increasingly expensive original discs. There was also Fenrir, another optical drive emulator that launched in 2020, which was generally more affordable than previous options. These hardware solutions created a renaissance for Saturn gaming, allowing enthusiasts to experience the system's library without the fragility and loading times associated with optical media. Alongside these hardware developments, software emulation of the Saturn was making steady progress. Due to the complex architecture of the system, accurate Saturn emulation lagged behind other consoles of its era. RetroArch's Beetle Saturn Core had become one of the most popular ways to emulate Saturn games across multiple platforms. The growing availability of Saturn games through both hardware modifications and software emulation contributed to a renewed interest in homebrew development for the system. One of the most notable homebrew developers was Orion, who released a Saturn port of the indie hit Cave Story in 2013. The community was further energized by the discovery and release of previously unreleased official games, such as the 2018 release of Sonic the Hedgehog's unfinished Saturn edition. Commercial support for the Saturn has also returned in unexpected ways. Companies like Columbus Circle in Japan and Retrobit in the West have released officially licensed Saturn controllers compatible with modern systems, allowing the Saturn's iconic control pad to find new life on current platforms. Limited reissues of Saturn accessories have appeared as well, catering to the growing collector's market. The Saturn's status as a misunderstood marvel of its era has only grown with time. What was once seen as a commercial failure is now recognized as a fascinating console that was perhaps ahead of its time in many ways. Its focus on 2D excellence, arcade-perfect ports, and unique Japanese titles now seems prescient, anticipating the indie game revolution and digital distribution models that would emerge years later. In the words of former Sega of America President Bernie Stoller, who initially declared that the Saturn is not our future, it was a mistake as far as hardware was concerned. The games were terrific, but the hardware just wasn't there. Time has vindicated at least half of his assessment. The games were indeed terrific, and they've ensured that the Sega Saturn, with its total worldwide sales of 9.2 million units, has outlived its commercial disappointment to become one of gaming's most fascinating and beloved cult classics. Thanks for exploring the history of this legendary console with me. If there's a gaming phenomenon you want me to dive into, drop a comment. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a video.